Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. As you can see, Dr. Paul is still not back, but he's on his way back, so he'll be back soon. I'm joined today by my old friend and someone I admire very much, who I can't believe how much he writes now, Phil Giraldi. Phil, are you there?
Yes, I am.
All right, thanks. Now, Phil was a career CIA officer. He was in the government for, I think, about 3 decades. Before that, he was an Army officer, Army intelligence officer. So he knows how this business works, and that's why we really like to consult him on these issues. And we're going to talk about the Grassley Memo, which, there was a lot of hype about the Nunes Memo. You don't hear a lot about the Grassley, which came out earlier this week, and I think Phil and I agree that it's much more explosive in many ways. But before we get into that, while I have Phil on the line, we want to talk a little bit about kind of a breaking development. Last night, the U.S. military, which is in Syria without authorization, attacked Syrian army forces, and apparently, according to press reports, killed some 100 Syrian fighters. The U.S. claims it was in self-defense. Phil, do you have reaction, additional information, anything else to add to this?
Well, the whole argument that it was self-defense is, of course, ridiculous. We are in Syria illegally, and we are sponsoring rebels against the legitimate government of Syria. And in this case, the Syrian army, according to the U.S. account, was moving against these rebels, and also ISIS, which is located in the same area. And the United States considered this to be an attack against itself, and launched artillery and airstrikes and killing 100 Syrian soldiers. This is completely ridiculous. The United States has no interest whatsoever in Syria, has even less interest in removing Bashar al-Assad, and is essentially playing into the hands of a number of other parties in the region. I would cite the Turks, I would cite the Israelis, who have their own agendas, the Saudis, of course, and we're not going to gain anything out of this. And in fact, we are going to wind up losing, just as we have in every other place in Asia that we've been in the last 15 years.
It's almost something like Chuck Spinney would describe as a self-licking ice cream cone. You kill 100 Syrian army military personnel who are fighting ISIS, and what happens? ISIS stays strong enough that you can justify remaining in the country. There's still ISIS here. We keep killing the guys who are killing ISIS, But, the other issue is this oil field around Deir ez-Zor, the Conoco field. And I don't know if you saw this. The Moon of Alabama had an interesting take on it, that maybe the Syrian military was sucked into a trap laid by the U.S. And the issue is getting control of these oil fields. Do you think there's something to that, or what else is at play here?
Well, the oil argument always seems to pop up. I think it's a lot less relevant now than it was at one point, because oil prices have dropped considerably. It's not quite as desired a commodity as it once was. I think the real argument here to be made is the one you were just suggesting, that this is an excuse for the United States to keep a foot in the door in Syria, and it's basically supporting ISIS in a funny way to make sure that it has an excuse to stay in the area and to be relevant. I think we're looking at relevance, or we're looking at an attempt by the U.S. not to be embarrassed more than almost anything else. And if that's what's happening, it's indeed shameful.
As someone wrote somewhere, this is exactly what Hillary would have done, so the whole argument that, at least Trump is not starting more wars like Hillary would have done, kind of falls flat. But we should probably turn to the Grassley Memo, Grassley and Graham. I hate mentioning Senator Graham, so I'll just call it the Grassley Memo. We both read through it. We've read a lot of commentary about it. There's a commenter on a site that I enjoy going to, which is Sic Semper Tyrannis, run by Pat Lang, former intelligence officer. Publius Tacitus is his nom de guerre, has written about it. Phil, you've read it, you've dissected it, you've digested it, you've done everything you can. If you can, in a nutshell, tell us what are the few takeaways that you've gotten from the Grassley Memo.
Well, I think there is one. When I read the Nunes Memo, I felt there was a lot missing from it. I felt there were a lot of counter arguments that the FBI and indeed the Democrats could have been making to justify the FISA requests based on other evidence than the Steele dossier. And I felt that that was a major omission with what I was seeing. Now, the Grassley report fills those holes. It basically says, it demonstrates that the Steele dossier was the principal source of information that was used to obtain the FISA warrants and to obtain the surveillance authority. And that basically this dossier was not vetted. It was not checked out at the time it was used. It had a lot of material that even Comey later on described as salacious. And essentially, this was used to authorize the surveillance of an American citizen and under suspicion of being a Russian agent. So the whole thing is a lot worse than it would have appeared from the Nunes memo. And I think we are basically looking at some level of collusion within the government to damage the Trump campaign in some way or another. And I think that the Grassley memo essentially validates that argument. And also, of course, there's the question of Steele himself. If you read the Grassley memo carefully, including the footnotes, it seems that Steele might well have been a double agent for the British. He might have been working to keep the British informed while he was manipulating what the United States was doing. It's a hell of a story.
It is. It's a spy thriller. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest beyond the usual partisan interest, sort of a half-baked Republican glomming onto this because they're still wedded to the Russia narrative, and then the resistance on the Democrat side just trying to ignore the whole thing. But I think you're absolutely right. The Grassley menu, why do I say menu? The Grassley memo really hits it out of the park when it comes to pointing the blame completely with the use of the Steele dossier to get the FISA permission. A couple of other things that popped up, I don't know if you saw it, I've seen it elsewhere, that perhaps Page was an FBI asset. Apparently that's what he had been in the past, and he becomes a walk-on. He walks on and volunteers in the Trump campaign, and then they get the authorization to surveil. It almost makes you wonder about Page, about whether or not he was more involved than just an innocent person volunteering on the campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that argument too. I don't think the Grassley memo says much to that, but it's certainly plausible. I mean, the whole fact that he was investigated for his ties to Russia and then suddenly resurfaces, 3 years later, as part of the Trump campaign is suspicious. And he clearly was never a player in the Trump campaign, but to a certain extent has portrayed himself, perhaps in exaggeration, as being more than what he was. So it's a tantalizing detail. I think that one should, at this point, should not count out a lot of things that went on. Another thing I would have liked to have seen more in both the memo and the letter was more talk about what the intelligence community was up to, because John Brennan was clearly going on fishing expeditions with friendly intelligence services in Europe and elsewhere, and he basically was digging up information that later surfaced in one way or another. That's an interesting story too.
And supposedly there are future memos coming out. The State Department was specifically mentioned. Maybe we'll hear some more. But I think you did a piece a few weeks ago about how politicized people like Brennan and Clapper and Mike Morrell and others were, and how that's almost sort of unprecedented for top senior intelligence people to be so overtly in favor of one political outcome in an election. And think about how it's one that they particularly could have affected. Now, the other, you mentioned Comey earlier, and this is an interesting issue. So you have Comey. Is he being deceptive? Is he being dumb? But here he says, on the one hand, we're going to rely on Steele because we've used him in the past. We know this guy's totally reliable. And then he briefs Trump and said, this stuff is salacious, it's unverified, I don't know where it comes from. How do you justify these two different views of Comey on Steele's work?
Or even the argument that he knifed Hillary and he exonerated Hillary and then knifed her in the back. I mean, this is a guy who to a certain extent, appears to be somewhat unhinged in terms of his perceptions. What he's the head of the FBI. I mean, he's not exactly an anonymous party sitting out there who doesn't have a viewpoint that matters. And yet he does these flip-flops. He does them almost effortlessly. I don't know how to explain them. I guess maybe somebody who was kind of drunk with power and wasn't paying much attention to what he was doing, someone who did have a political agenda. I don't know really how to judge him.
Here's something interesting from the Grassley Memo, and this has come out a little bit, but I don't know that it's fully fleshed out. It looks like Steele threw a bit of a hissy fit when it looked like they were going to start looking back into the Clinton emails, and that's when he went and started talking to the press. Even though he said that he hadn't talked to the press, and that lying to the FBI about talking to the press is what caused them to end their relationship with Steele, even though they continued using his work even after they found him disreputable and someone who was deceptive. But here he has a hissy fit that the FBI is going to start looking back into these emails. He goes and starts squawking to the press, and then later, the same interview noted that Steele was, quote, desperate to see that Trump was not elected president. So this is a guy with clear bias who the FBI accepts his information carte blanche. I mean, how can this kind of, is it bumbling or worse?
Well, some of the stuff is as a former intelligence officer myself, some of the stuff is pure intelligence officer, how you play these things. He clearly was partisan to Hillary. There was no question about that. And as you say, he suddenly shifted gears when it seemed that they were going to be looking at the emails. So what he did was he basically went to the media and he used the leaks to the media to validate the stuff that he was giving to the FBI, which at that point was not checked out, could not be corroborated. It wasn't that it was not checked out. It was checked out, but they couldn't corroborate a lot of the stories that he was telling. That's a whole different level of impropriety. And so he was validating his own stuff for the FBI with expectation that the FBI would do something about Trump. This is, he's, well, what can I say? He's an intelligence officer, and that's the way we operate.
Yeah, but he got a lot of money for that too, though, so it was a pretty good gig. The other thing that I haven't really seen fleshed out a lot, Phil, is it's genuinely accepted. It's accepted wisdom. It's conventional wisdom that the sources for Steele's dossier were his Russian sources. That's kind of accepted without question. But do we know that's true? What would lead us to believe that? Here's a guy, he can't go to Russia. He's not dealt with Russia in a long time. What about the assumption that these sources were Russian sources? Because that seems to back up the idea that even if it was salacious, even if it was bogus, it was still Russian sources and Russian meddling. Do you think there's any sort of opening to question what these sources, where they really came from?
Yeah, I think this is another huge hole in the story. I think, well, first of all, that we're talking about probably what they refer to as a principal agent here. That would be somebody, not necessarily a Russian, who has Russian contacts, and these Russian contacts were the actual sources of the information. And I would also further doubt that Steele had any actual Russian agents on the ground in Moscow, because it's very unlikely for an American or a Brit or a Western European to meet a Russian source inside Russia. It would be incredibly dangerous for the source. So I don't think any of that took place.
Interesting. The other part about it that struck me, and I'm sure that it struck you too, just look at this scenario. So the Clinton campaign funded Steele's work to get dirt, to do opposition research, political opposition research on Trump. And then, according to the Grassley Memo, which wasn't in the Nunes Memo, the Clinton campaign operatives were feeding him information. It was he received unsolicited and unverified intelligence from Clinton-associated forces. The strong implication here is that it was Sid Blumenthal or someone in the State Department. So here you have this round and round. We hire you to dig up dirt. And by the way, here's some dirt. You think about the financial relationship he has with the Clintons. If he were to say, "No, I don't want your dirt. I'll get my own dirt," then he's biting the hand that feeds him. This seems to be one of the craziest parts of it.
Yeah, absolutely. The fact that he was getting information on Trump and Trump's associates from the Clinton administration is a bombshell, I think. But there were also lesser bombshells. He was also getting information from State Department, and he was also in a loop with Victoria Nuland, the famous Victoria Nuland, and so there was a lot of stuff going on here that really needs to be looked at.
I hadn't seen the Nuland stuff. She's one of my favorites to watch. What have you seen about that?
I've seen that Nuland defended Steele in testimony the other day.
Oh.
And it was clear that she knew him and had been meeting with him.
That adds another layer because she was expecting to be Secretary of State in the Clinton administration. And for our viewers who don't connect the dots necessarily, Nuland is part of the infamous Kagan clan, the neoconservative family that essentially almost runs Washington, wouldn't you say, Phil?
They're trying to, yes.
It tries to. The Institute for the Study of War is run by her sister-in-law, of course, and if you look down their donor list, it's people who love war, so they fund it. Another thing, Phil, that in going back to the Sic Semper Tyrannis site, Pat Lang's site, and this is the issue, and you touched on it earlier, but this idea of Steele as an FBI intelligence asset. He mentions an FD 1023 form that was filled out, meaning that he's an intelligence asset for the FBI, but he's a former MI6 agent for the British government. And the question that this piece brings up is, did he tell his former bosses, "I'm going to become an intelligence asset for the FBI"? And they said, "Okay, go for it." In which case you clearly have actually British government meddling in the election. Or did he go rogue and not tell? I mean, Phil, you couldn't just go, even now, you couldn't just go volunteer to help a foreign intelligence service, could you?
No, and not legally get away with it. The British are a lot tougher on this than we are because they have the Official Secrets Act, which backs up it gives them basically ability to control former officers in terms of what they do and what they say. And Steele would have been very conscious of this unless he were working for the British government. That's why when we started out, I mentioned this possibility that he would maybe a double agent or a triple agent, depending on how many sides you want to count. But the fact is, yeah, they would not look kindly on that. And someone made the point that he went to Rome to meet with an FBI agent initially. Well, in fact, the Washington Post yesterday had an article that they said the first meeting actually was in London. Now, that would have been very dangerous for Steele if he were going rogue and doing this independently. The second meeting was in Rome, and that included 3 FBI officers in addition to the one in Rome who had come out of Washington. So, there are a lot of angles to this story, and it looks to me like the British were certainly in the loop on this. His former boss, Sir John Dearlove, was also in the Post yesterday, and he came up with this complicated explanation about what a great guy Steele was, which to me would be a red flag going up by itself.
Yeah, as you point out, if he had gone rogue, then why would his former boss say, "Oh no, great guy"? And I think in the Pat Lang piece, they talked about him still being used by MI6, still the go-to guy on Russian business. So, and the other thing that was mentioned in the same piece was his lawyers claim that he cannot deliver a deposition to the London court because it would, quote, harm UK national security interess. Doesn't that suggest British government involvement in this?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I can't think of any other British security interests that would be quite phrased that way. The British interest in this, if they were not involved in any way directly, would be minimal. But if the British knew about what was going on and knew about some of the deceptions that were taking place, this would be a major, or could be, a major bombshell in the relationship between Britain and the U.S. in terms of intelligence.
You know, Phil, the thing that's a little bit depressing, you look at the Grassley Memo, you look at the Nunes Memo, and the Grassley, as we point out, I think is much stronger, and hopefully there's more strong memos to come. To me, this seems like such a huge bombshell. It seems like, I mean, it's cliche, but it seems like Watergate on steroids. Do you foresee anything happening, or is this sort of a, you know, kind of a tree falling in the woods? I mean, it looks like people should go to jail. FBI people, maybe other intelligence community people, you know, Clinton campaign people. Is it just us?
Well, I think unfortunately, whether you want to call it the deep state or the establishment, really has a vested interest in making this go away. And the deep state or establishment is both the Democratic and Republican parties. So they don't, I think, want this to go beyond a certain point. They would like to see the Russians blamed for this, which is why the Russian team, in spite of the fact that neither the Nunes nor Grassley memos implicated Russia in any way, in spite of that fact, you see the mainstream media going straight back to the Russian thing. It's all about Russia. We're protecting Trump from the consequences of what went on with Russia. There's no evidence for that.
Yeah, that was the first thing I thought with the Nunes memo. I thought, you know, maybe there'll be a smoking gun in here about Russia. There was nothing. It was bizarre. And it's even underscored more in the Grassley memo that Russia just not involved. It's just not there. There's nothing there. You know, it's interesting to see the left now embracing George W. Bush, and who said yesterday, or was it today, he said, quote, "There's pretty clear evidence the Russians meddled in our election. Whether it affected the outcome or not is another question." That seems to be sort of the default, you know, that seems to be the synthesis, if you look at it in Marxist terms, in the dialectical terms. That will be the synthesis that we're left with. But there still doesn't seem to be any basis upon which to base that judgment.
Yeah, and that's absolutely correct. I mean, and you know when you're getting something from George W. Bush, he probably fell out and hit his head or something like that, and the thought came to him. But you know it's not reliable. And of course, there are a whole slew of Democratic luminaries. Eric Holder keeps sounding off on this. Was there ever a more incompetent government official than Eric Holder?
But he's thinking about running for president now. Did you see that?
Oh, yeah. Why not?
All right, yeah, everyone can take Oprah with him. So are there any final takeaways on the Grassley? I think we pretty much covered it. Is there anything that I didn't cover that we probably should bring up, Phil?
Yeah. Well, I keep hearing people, like us that are critical of what's been going on, that are saying, this kind of ices it. Well, it doesn't really ice it till somebody's in jail. And I am waiting to see what evidence there was of State Department collusion with this process, and also particularly of the intelligence agency, particularly CIA and particularly John Brennan. This has not come down at all yet, and I think there is stuff there that potentially could make what we've seen so far look like child's play.
Hear, hear. Well, more memos, more leaking. We need it. We need to get to the bottom of this. Let's hope that we do keep seeing more. Phil, in the meantime, thank you so much for coming on and helping me break this down. I really appreciate your analysis and your perspectives.
Thank you very much, Dan.
And I also want to thank our viewers for watching the Liberty Report. We bring you the real news that you won't see in the mainstream media. So stick with us and come back and see us next time.